Hi everyone, David Cross here. Thank you for joining my video today. What I want to cover is a short video on the integration with AWS, how we use the Cloud Automation Appliance, the APIs to interface with that configuration, and how that appears within IPControl in terms of synchronizing data and automating the creation of subnets and the creation of IP addresses. So just to quickly, as a high-level overview, understand how we organize this information. Within IPControl, we have a container construct, as you may know, that is a hierarchical representation of sites or logical containers where you can organize networks and subnets. So what I have in my IPControl instance is I have an AWS container where I'm basically defining my VPCs or networks. And underneath those networks, I'm defining various availability zones that are very specific to Amazon. So in this environment, they have different data centers, and I can set up different subnets in their console to effectively point back to different areas. So what I effectively want to do here then is I created a network block, the 172.31, which is a private block in that VPC. And I have the object ID, which is created for that VPC within Amazon itself. So my VPC itself is this block, and it's just the one I have in my development environment. So with that, in the cloud types, I select AWS, specifying its type, but we are building on top of others. And of course, you can represent any of these types if these are representing the type of cloud environment you have today. So from a very simple standpoint, that's all I needed to do here. And from a cloud automation appliance, just a high-level overview of it real quick as we move through this. The cloud automation appliances can be both physical and virtual, as well as IPControl and its software can be physical or virtual, and can be in the cloud environment like AWS or Azure. So those instances can be spun up in the cloud. You can go out to Amazon.com in the marketplace or AWS.com, and you can search for Sapphire, and that'll give you a list of the appliances. So with that, we have a bring your own license. You would then contact someone with Diamond IP, and we would effectively sell you a license that you would then implement for those services, allowing you to configure, manage it, and do those things. And one of those particular appliances is what we call the Cloud Automation Appliance. And it is built on top of, or Node-RED is built on top of this Cloud Automation Appliance, which is built on our Sapphire OS. And we've put Node-RED as a workflow and orchestration tool that allows you to drag and drop and build and wire things together to build effectively workflows that can then be consumed by endpoint APIs or clients or tasks and processes. So in this process, the way that Node-RED works is each of these kind of squares you see on the screen are considered nodes, or they're tiny JavaScript applications, basically. They're written mostly in asynchronous logic and promises and so forth, and allow for the developer to wrap their code around these nodes, which can then be simply drag and dropped onto a canvas. And then each of these nodes has effectively an expected payload input, which the payload is a JSON object for the JavaScript. And depending on the type of node and its instruction, it is requesting certain types of parameters or properties passed in that payload. Now, what we have and what we have included in the CAA are a series of IP address management nodes. So in the build that we're running, which is a 1.16, we've included the add subnets, networks, the gets and the exports and capabilities. And we've included a number of AWS in this first release that allows us to synchronize data into the cloud or from the cloud. So as they're using the tools here to add or create different subnets and things along the way, you can then tell this cloud automation to synchronize that data, bringing it down into your IPControl instance or in the cloud if that's where it's installed, and then to synchronize the data into the containers that best represent that area, which is dynamically constructed based on where that's being queried in the tool. So to quickly kind of go over those that are included, at least on the workflow, we have a very basic login process, just to kind of give you an example. And the way that these nodes will work is you have effectively a endpoint, which is the end where you're going to be consuming, and that is a HTTP request node or end node. And from here, you can select different types of input parameters like get or post or put and delete, etc. And this then, dragging this and wiring it into other nodes, which a response node effectively gives us the ability to consume this as a API. And so we pass it its required parameters, it does its task, and then returns the payload. And each one of these nodes passes the payload into the next node. That node can then manipulate the data within the payload, or it can copy things into a separate section so that it doesn't overwrite it. And it can keep everything intact, passing it into the next node. And our specific nodes have the ability to set more of a custom output so that other tasks in line can then process the details in the payload. So it's a payload in output system until you have a final response back to the client. So in this, you have the sync. We then have the sync subnets. And just to quickly go over this with the time, we have here what we're doing is logging in. And in this login in the payload, we're passing the VPC, the availability zone. We're also telling it to add and or delete any new subnets that it discovers when it does this export. It exports from Amazon, it exports from IPControl, and then groups the two together with differences. And those differences are either adds, deletes, or they're common, meaning they're in both sources. And then it passes that data down into the various nodes that then manipulate the payload so that it then calls an import address block into IPControl and or runs the delete block if there's any available deletes or should have deletes in terms of the data. And in the result, what we're going to get is basically all of those subnets and that data basically passed back to the client in a JSON structure. So to actually demonstrate this real quick, and I'll show you that synchronization, I have in my VPC, and I want to make sure this is empty, right? So there's nothing there. And I have just a real quick script that I'm going to run to sync the subnets. And I have in this script telling it to pass VPC information and all of the private details. And what that then did is it went out and queried Amazon and queried the two sources and determined that the subnet that needs to be imported was this 3100. And that does, of course, match into my subnet, right? So far, great. Well, the next step of this is within the subnet, we have individual IP hosts. These are effectively your instances in Amazon and web services or others. And from there, you're then going to have the ability within the subnet to tell it to import those details. And the second part to note about this as well, and I should have probably brought this up previously, if you're using Amazon maybe for multiple customers or tenancy, and you're tracking additional user-defined data through tags, that data does get transferred down into these calls. So you can process that data through scripting or your APIs to further pull that detail in or determine really what to do next, like I've done here with the container. Okay. So that next step there, I'm going to go ahead and I want to synchronize the IP addresses. And we'll tell this then to bring down the IPs, and then we should have effectively just the one instance I have, which is the 112. And if I navigate down into that subnet where actually I was and just tell it to filter, this will then show me the host that it imported, pulling it back as a static IP address, and then allowing me to do other things like setting up the description and or resource records or other things that might be associated to this device. Okay, so that's one method there, and those are two real quick ways to synchronize the data in an initial build as we start looking at that data. Now, the second thing to this is creating the subnets, and we have a flow that allows us then to create subnets via API. We then use IPControl to determine the next available subnet. Then we import it, and then we import it into Amazon Web Services. From there, we get this unique ID that gets transferred back down into IPControl, and we store that subnet ID, which is generated by Amazon, with the subnet so we can track it moving forward. So here we can just do the create or add subnet. I think here I need to specify at least a user. And we create the subnet, and I can run this a couple of times, just to do this and give you some sequence. You'll see here all of the subnets that were then created all the way to 1230. And then within IPControl in that same area, we're going to see those same subnets. And on the flip side of all of this, we then have the delete subnets where we can then tell it to delete a specific block or blocks. And actually, I don't have that. 1, 3. We'll do 2, and we'll do 1, and that'll then clean up these. So nice. And if I refresh this again and look at this list, I'm back to my single instance. And of course, I could delete it here and then resync and do those again. So that's a real high level. And one last point here as I'm getting up to the 10-minute mark. As you're building this into the web UI and you're adding these transactions, we have an effective process called a call-out manager. So every transaction for an add, delete, or modify can be set up to pass that detail into an external script. And that external script then could call these functions telling it to add or delete or update the subnets or synchronize or do that type of function. So we can do that, and that is something that you can enable and build on top of in addition to the APIs and the ability to work with this in a more 24/7 type capacity by having our Cloud Automation Appliance automatically or fail over to the backup systems and other as needed. So there's a quick video. Hope it's not too long. Hope you got some highlights on, again, what we're doing within the IP address space and synchronizing data. Take care, and hope to see you again on a future video.